Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is with the New York Times' Conor Dougherty. Conor reports on the state of American housing. In this conversation, we discuss the nature of the housing crisis and how we can best approach the situation. We go through why efforts to make the demand side of housing may have promise but have a bunch of flaws, and the broader conversation of why increasing supply through a variety of different means is probably the best way forward. Hope you all enjoy the conversation, and a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Conor Dougherty, welcome back to the Realignment.
Thanks for having me. It's been a while. I guess it was during the pandemic.
2021.
Yeah.
Mid-pandemic. I caught you towards the tail end of your book tour. And today's episode is all about housing and how it relates to American politics broadly. But considering it's been a couple of years, can you just sort of introduce people to your beat and just offer a quick summary of the book?
Yeah. So it's funny. I feel like this book was kind of chapter one of this thing. I wrote a book in 2020. Again, it's called Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America, or I think it has a different subtitle now. But anyway, and the essential gist of the book was that we have made it very difficult to build housing in these really high growth, high opportunity cities, the San Franciscos, the Bostons, the New Yorks, and really even other places like Minneapolis and Nashville, Seattle, all these places where you're seeing significant job growth, significant sort of, for lack of a better term, knowledge economy concentration, that we'd made it very difficult to build housing in those places. And it was creating, this gentrification, the kind of income stratification, all the things, kind of a extreme microcosm of all the things that are ailing America sort of more generally. And I think that my diagnosis at that time was pretty good, but so much has changed since then. I remember one of the first stories I wrote during the pandemic was about how Spokane, Washington had become super expensive all of a sudden because, of course, work from home was allowing people to move to further markets. And then there was this whole phenomenon of Zoom towns. And recently, as you and I just spoke about last week, I did a story in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is a kind of a lot of people probably heard of it, but it's a mid-size city. The region county is about 250,000 people. And I guess what I was thinking about when I went to Kalamazoo was, there's really nowhere you can go anymore now. That it used to be housing was this kind of game of dominoes where if you were in one of these really expensive cities like the ones I just mentioned, San Francisco, et cetera, you could always just move to another place where it's a little cheaper. But pretty quickly, as I said, you saw the Portlands, the Spokanes, the Boise's, all these other places were very quickly becoming super expensive. And now this last story, like I said, it's kind of like if you can't afford Kalamazoo anymore, you just really can't afford anywhere. All of America is now enmeshed in this housing crisis that when I first got into this and kind of focused on in the book was very at what for a long time had been really limited to a certain type of city. So this is why you're now seeing Vice President Harris talk about the housing crisis in her DNC speech. This is why you hear J.D. Vance talking all the time about housing, even in Ohio, places like that traditionally had been relatively affordable, are expensive. So this has become a national issue specifically because of that evolution I just told you about. It's no longer this coastal problem. It's no longer this California sickness. It's this national housing crisis that every politician sort of can't run away from anymore. Now, I should probably say that it's not that Kalamazoo's and the places I just mentioned are still plenty affordable to somebody who is moving there from a really high cost market, but they've become largely unaffordable for the people who live and work there. And that's really the that's the sickness, that you can no longer kind of afford housing in the city where you live and work and where your wages are determined by that local economy.
Here's where I want to start then. Let's actually define the housing crisis now that we're not just talking about San Francisco, LA, New York, et cetera. Because even in your articulation of Kamala Harris and then JD Vance, YIMBY, NIMBY fights, debates over housing construction, it's pretty clear that all of the different sectors and actors and ideological coalitions who are attacking this quote unquote problem are actually coming from different sets of assumptions of what the actual problem is. So if you're JD Vance and you're talking about the housing crisis through the lens of if we mass deport illegal immigrants, there'll be always housing available for people. That would suggest that the problem isn't that we can't build houses quick enough. The problem isn't that the supply isn't big enough. The problem is actually that there are just people who shouldn't be here who are taking up space, and America is in a very zero-sum situation there. A lot of folks who also know a lot about the whole, like, isn't private equity buying all these houses? Once again, like restricting that supply that way. So can you just kind of give the sort of different articulations of what the problem you'll hear from all these different groups are, and how that sorting through those different sets of assessments could lead us to something actually productive?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And untangling this mess is, a mess. And it's what I've been spending basically a decade, possibly more, depending on how you want to date it, trying to unsort this. Okay, in the end, we do have a housing shortage. And I think basically everyone there that you just mentioned would agree with that to some extent. Even if JD Vance didn't think that there was an actual shortage, he would say, oh, well, there's a shortage relative to the number of people who want that housing right now. Thus, we can, remove some of that demand. I do not think, for what it's worth, that would be super effective, in part because, pretty large amount of the construction industry is immigrant labor. But nevertheless, that qualitative idea, thus we should sort of remove demand, is one you hear a lot of. In California, for instance, you would hear people say, why can't they move to Michigan? Kind of hilariously, now Michigan, is got a housing shortage. So we do not, I think it is pretty much fact. I feel comfortable saying it's fact, though some people might disagree with it, that we have a housing shortage. Just to go through a couple numbers, we build, give or take, to keep up with population growth, you need something like 1.5 million new homes a year. I should say, to keep up with demand, you need something like 1.5 million new homes a year. And that's everything from, some homes do deteriorate and you need to replace them, to, there are different kinds of household units. Sometimes there's smaller units like college kids live alone or live with a roommate or two, and then there are larger families. Okay, the point is we need something like 1.5 million new homes a year. We have, since 2009, during the Great Recession, built something like 1.2 million a year on average. So each year we're a couple 100,000 behind, and over many, and that's not a big deal in any one year, but over 17 years or 15 years or whatever it is of that, depending on when you want to date the end of the Great Recession, that becomes millions that you are behind, right? Mm-hmm. And that's as true in San Francisco as it is in Michigan. Now, people would diagnose that differently. They would say, oh, in San Francisco, you have a whole bunch of rules. In Michigan, you just, there are some, you also have rules, but it's also, there's not as mature of the building industry there isn't as, it's a lot of smaller firms. And so it's harder to just pick up demand the same way. Again, I don't want to untangle all this, but but just to make things easy, we do have a large amount, we have more demand than we do housing for them. So the YIMBY, yes, in my backyard idea here is, let's make it way easier to build as much housing as we can build relative to demand, right? So let's just build a ton more housing. Eventually the demand will, the supply will outrun the demand, and prices will start to come down. You could call it simplistic, and I'm sure in many cases it is, but on the whole, it makes logical sense, right? Then you hear other people say, we have basically, it's not a problem of supply, it's a problem of demand. So people are buying Airbnbs, and that's taking homes that would be, permanent homes and making them functionally hotel rooms. So that's thus we should get rid of Airbnbs, and that will open up more supply for long-term homeowners. That's essentially a demand size argument, right? You will hear people say, I don't think the private equity, so you will hear people say Blackstone and all these people.
By the way, I'll just tell you something. At a sniff test level, I'm incredibly skeptical of that narrative. I'll just say my bias going into it.
No, that narrative, let me put it this way. It seems to me that it's basically without question that a home that an investor buys removes a purchase home from the pool of people who would want to buy that home as a single family home. I mean, that, right? But they rent it out. So some demand is going to live there, right? So you could argue they're making it harder for people to buy their first home or to buy a home that they wish to own, right? So they're without question competition for that asset. The same way, I don't know, if you wanted to buy a particular stock for $50 and someone was willing to spend $55, you wouldn't get, whatever.
And to clarify real quick, when I said I was skeptical of that narrative, I'm not skeptical that it happens. I'm not skeptical that the rent to ownership dynamic could be screwed up in a housing market. What I'm more saying is, especially if you're way too on Twitter, I think especially because it fits into conspiracies about Wall Street and shady finance. It's overstated as a cause of the problem relative to like these broader structural forces we're talking about. I just want to make that clear there.
They're not leaving them empty. I mean, the Airbnb argument is at least this is being used as a hotel room when it should be used as a permanent residence, either rent or own, for someone who's going to live and work in this community. That argument is, even if you disagree that it's a cause, like you can see the logic of it, right? The private equity argument is less good because it's sort of saying this will go to a renter instead of an owner, but overall demand, that shouldn't make a difference.
Well, real quick, just to stick on this for a second, because you're helping me learn here. I guess the better argument on the private equity, BlackRock, Blackstone, whichever one of those two does it side, isn't the argument that they'd be increasing prices by coming into these housing markets. So they're making housing. So even if the house is, let's say, available for rent, they're driving up the rent, and then they're actually making the overall market cost too much relative to, let's say, like millennials, Gen Z, and then Xers who are trying to get in. Yeah.
I mean, look, I don't think that we should just dismiss Blackstone so Blackstone has a stake in a company called Invitation Homes, and BlackRock, they both do it. Right.
Okay.
So, and investing has become much easier. Investing in homes has become much easier. And this is actually also true for smaller investors. And I could get into a whole long narrative about how that happened, but essentially it has become way easier to manage a portfolio of single family homes than it was. So small landlords back in the day, it might be a person who owns 2 or 3 homes. It might be a small partnership that owns, 10 or 20, but they, generally speaking, are relatively geographically isolated and were a pain to manage, required a lot of having handy people and all this sort of thing, right? It is now possible for even a relatively small investor, through various contracting and other things, to manage a pretty small but large, meaning it's not tens of thousands of homes, it was like 100 homes in different markets. And that would have been really quite a bit difficult. So it is true that investing in homes has gotten way easier. And it is true that this has probably increased competition for those homes, right? And thus probably increased the price relative to what they would have gotten, right? But what I think has really happened, and this is both a good and bad thing, I think these investors have basically put a floor under prices. I find it kind of hard to believe we could ever have a full-on collapse in the housing market the way we did in 2009. Don't get me wrong, prices can definitely come down, prices can, right? But once they hit some level at which it could rent, like people will just crowd into the market in a way that they did when home prices were just falling like a rock during the foreclosure crisis, right? So I do actually think that investors have had they've really created a kind of a liquidity to the market, or a sort of like I said, I think they put a floor in their home prices, and I think they have changed how a lot of things go in the housing market. And I think it's probably true that on the margins they have moved more people towards renting that might have, at a slightly lower price, been able to buy, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think they've. It's almost impossible to believe that they have reduced the number of homes that someone can live in, and if anything, they probably increased them, because there are now all these rehab companies that will take basically abandoned homes and revamp them to habitability. So anyway, that's all pretty nerdy, but I just meant, like, if you're angry that an investor has outbid you for a home that let's say you offered asking price of $500,000 and they beat you at $525,000, right? Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that investor has, assuming there wasn't some other homeowner bidding, but you know what I mean? They have beat out homeowners for that asset. So in that sense, they are taking homes from ownership. That has to be true on the margins, right? What I don't, but that there's no evidence or even logic that has reduced the housing supply, right? So I guess all I'm saying is that when we talk about a housing crisis, we're talking about sort of a generic crisis of owners and renters, right? Okay. And that's, I think, different than they've beat me out for something I would like to own, right? And I think those things get grayed out. They get muddied in a way that I think being outraged at Blackstone for taking single opportunities from single family people who would like to own a home. I think that's, whether or not you want to be outraged about it is kind of a political / value statement, but like, it's not illogical to think that they are having some impact on that. But it is illogical to think they're like reducing the housing supply. And I think, this just shows you, though, how people who are very focused on home ownership as the one true way of living in America, they sort of see Blackstone as like a problem, but they're just, that if you're to say, well, you could just rent the home, like that, you know what I mean? Like you're like that.
There's moral within our system and society. Exactly, right? There's a moral weight to that statement.
Yes. Whereas I'm not thinking about it that way. I'm thinking about, do we have enough homes for people, to rent or buy? And I'm not going to bias them. You know what I mean? Like if the cost of ownership goes up. Now, again, I don't want to keep going down this road, but obviously you could argue they've slightly increased the rent, stuff like that. There's not a lot of great evidence for that. There are people who have more general anger that they think housing should be owned locally. Again, all these things kind of rise to the level of what you think community, and they're politics, right? Not necessarily left, right, but they have a sort of political value to them, how I think things should be to them, right? And that's just fundamentally different from, do they reduce the number of houses? And the answer to that is like, no.
Something I'm curious about, to go to the migrant version of the issue and deportation leading to prices collapsing. What's the distribution? So you made the obvious counter that, well, this is a supply and a demand issue. And if we nuke the housing construction industry in certain states, not necessarily going to lead to enough housing for everybody. But I'd be curious about the overall distribution of like migrants who could be deported. Like for example, like I lived in New York, I lived in DC. If there was some sort of mass deportation program, something tells me like that's not going to make those housing markets like any more accessible. I don't think the problems of San Francisco will be solved because there's sort of an excess number of migrants who are living places. Like how should we think about like the actual way that the migrant effect on the housing market plays out if we don't just treat it as like a total number of people, but instead look at actual markets, whereas it could be a determinant of prices and
so
supply.
I don't have there's not. So let me just say at a high level before I take this question, I'm generally speaking skeptical of hardcore demand side solutions, right? Now, meaning that people who say, let's just find a way to make people want less housing, right? I find that to be that I'm skeptical that can be all that effective. Now, I'm not saying it's can't ever do anything, right? Like Airbnb bans or whatever you want to call them, quotas, caps, whatever. I mean, I had a friend who was an Airbnb person, city, who owned a couple Airbnbs. The regulations became quite onerous and they started to get quite scared that they were going to get busted. They started renting all the apartments. That's an anecdotal thing, but it absolutely, I observed that happen, right? So, I mean, do those 3 housing units make a much of a difference in the context of a larger? Probably not, but I have definitely observed this person say, I'm going to turn these over to like a different kind of stuff, right? Okay. People could move in together more. There is some evidence that housing, people really want to live alone or live with 1 or 2 roommates. They do not want to, people live in smaller units than they used to, right? So you could push for more. I guess what I'm saying is that there are all sorts of ways in which housing demand could be smaller. And all of those proposals are not like wrong. And I'm going to take the immigrant one in just a second. I'm just saying, I don't think they could work. I don't think they'd be that effective, right?
At scale relative to the gap in hundreds of thousands
you start
of
to get
homes
into
per
like
year.
social engineering stuff. Again, Airbnb regulations are one that seemed like the most logical. I don't think they have a huge impact, but they're not completely crazy, right? Asking people to live together in smaller units. I mean, theoretically, prices should be just doing that. You know what I mean? So, okay. So, and my only point is, I feel like demand is the hardest to actually do anything on, even if it's not that the proposal is crazy, right? Okay. So just to take immigrants. So immigration to the United States, legal and illegal, clearly increases housing demand. There are more households who need, there are more humans looking for a place to live than there would be absent this increase in the population and household growth that creates housing demand. So it's not to say like it's directionally completely wrong, right? I mean, it's kind of like saying people who have children are eventually increasing housing demand, right?
Yeah.
People who graduate college and move out of their dorm in search of a first apartment are absolutely increasing. There's all sorts of ways in which housing demand is created. Immigration is obviously one of them, right? People get divorced or another because they usually go to separate places, and that creates 2 households from one. Okay, so I don't think it would be terribly effective for one. I'm not really sure how you would implement a mass deportation on a scale without even touching that. Also, immigrant labor is a very important part of the construction industry. If you couldn't, if all of a sudden that was gone or heavily curbed, you might not be able to build enough homes for all the other sources of demand, which are all bigger, right? So, again, people, just regular or just people out in the world trying to find housing for whatever the reasons they move to a new place or whatever, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that if you pick off any one of these little things, it's hard to pick it off in isolation because it is one great big giant housing market. So, and I do think this is where the complication of housing leaves it susceptible to all these, kind of, I don't want to say bad faith, but sometimes bad faith. So for instance, there's all these people, obviously when I was covering the Bay Area housing crisis, isn't this just all tech's fault? And you're like, sure, yeah. Obviously, more people coming to the city to work at companies has increased housing demand. There's that's obviously true. Also, those people are why restaurants are opening and why unemployment is low and why, you can't just separate these things. I remember I was speaking to someone once and they were telling me, oh, doesn't it feel that San Francisco, if your life is unconnected from tech, somebody said this to me in the 2016, 17, like in the absolute heyday of when it was on fire, the, Google bus protests and all that sort of thing. Your life hasn't been improved that much. Just think about how much traffic there is. And I'm like, you can't do that. You know what I mean? You don't get to be like, oh, I love having all these restaurants open, but I don't like that home prices are high. You know what I mean? It just you cannot disaggregate. You
also like the tax revenue that comes from that too.
Also,
you can't unentangle.
Or I'd really like to drive across the bridge and have it be empty at noon on a Wednesday. Well, okay, you can do that in a place that's post-apocalyptic. You can't do it in a place that's vibrant and thriving. So, opportunity and kind of, demand are going to go together, right? So anyway, I guess what I'm just saying is on all these issues, it's hard to pull them apart. So taking all this together, we have a housing shortage relative to the demand. Fact. Otherwise, prices wouldn't be going up. Otherwise, housing wouldn't be hard to find, right? We could try to build more housing for that, which would have some, wouldn't have an effect everywhere, right? There might be some neighborhoods for which there would always be so many people trying to get in. There might be others where no matter how much you built out there, everyone's like, I don't want to live out there, right? But all of them are, generally speaking, we build more housing, we find a price, it would help the problem. Right. And I think that we have seen that that's an easier way of going about it than trying these kind of, like I said, these kind of more what amounts to social engineering, things where you're trying to get people to live in smaller units. Again, there are small things like the Airbnb thing, I think is one that on the margins in certain neighborhoods, it could definitely help. I don't think it would change much in terms of prices, but it's not directionally wrong.
Well, what I want to say here to sum up and bring these two parts of the demand and supply conversation together. No, it's good. This is super high insight. The big problem I'm hearing when you articulate the demand side of things is it just requires, in both the cases, so let's do the left-wing version. These tech billionaires are incredibly off-putting, annoying, and empirically are bringing in all this money, which is impacting the city. I've yet to see a solution other than radical taxation that'd be so high that they would leave that actually get that done. So we kind of spent 5 or 7 years discoursing on how tech was bad for Seattle, tech was bad for New York City, tech is bad for San Francisco. Didn't lead anywhere because once again, what's the actual solution you're proposing there? And then I guess maybe we'll get into some of the things that are down market from that, but also then once again on the mass deportation plan, if your plan requires not only winning the Senate and congressional and White House majority needed to actually do a sustained deportation plan over the course of a decade. And there are no issues and there aren't any states that stop cooperating with you because it's not like California is going to cooperate in this situation. The demand side just has too many. You need these 5 or 6 things to go together perfectly. Setting aside whether or not the theory actually works. So that's kind of a problem. The supply side is compelling. I think this is where you're seeing more consensus actually build because there's this very straightforward, actually, let's look at our state's permitting process. Hey, let's look at what the actual city code is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now that we spent some time going after the demand side, where as a reporter do you see vulnerabilities in the arguments or just the real world effects that the supply side people like to advance? Why is the story not as simple as they make it seem, basically? Because whenever I hear
I mean,
YIMBYs,
for
it sounds
starters,
nice, and I have there's just a knot in my stomach when I'm sort of like, this just seems a little too straightforward.
Well, so the first one, which a lot of so-called NIMBYs have a point on, you do have to start thinking about infrastructure in a really different way, right? Either you have to build it, right? So that's not just as easy as building housing. Or it's not as it requires a level of public investment to go with this private investment, right? So that's one thing. Or you have to like install a bunch of bike lanes to just really change how people move around the city in a way that, similar to the demand side things that I critiqued, does get into something like social engineering. You're basically telling people, if you want to navigate the city in a certain time frame, you're going to have to start riding a bike. Or if you want to park in certain neighborhoods where you're used to parking, it's just going to be basically impossible. You're going to have to, or you're going to have to pay a ton for it or whatever, so you start to really change how people are asked to live in a city, either by building a ton more infrastructure or really changing how people get around. Right. And I think, people who kind of have it's kind of funny, like some YIMBYs you'll meet have like almost like a liberal version of starve the beasters. There are some Republicans who sort of say, oh, it doesn't matter how many deficits you run, eventually everything will just collapse on itself. So we might as well lower taxes as much as possible because, everything will then just sort of go bankrupt and, basically.
Government will have to be smaller by definition.
Government will have to be smaller because we're eventually have so many, it's like I'm going to run the most irresponsible house possible so that my house will have to shrink in size to the level. I mean, basically, right? It's like saying I don't like that I live in a big house and thus I'm going to stop paying my mortgage for, that's effectively logic. There's a liberal version of that in cities in which they basically say, let's build as much as housing as much as possible. Let's do, and eventually driving around will become driving and navigating the city in the sort of standard way that many people do becomes so intolerable that bike lanes and all those things have to also happen. Right. So you do start, that is one part of they just build more that is not being contemplated, that how you navigate cities and whatever would have to be there would have to be a bigger change in that than people are appreciating. And
so wait, real quick, yeah. I want to engage on that because that's a really fascinating, the liberal version you're articulating here, because I think the reason why,
rarely see people say it, but that's clearly where it's.
Well, to me though, I think what's kind of appealing about that argument is that it gets the political order of operations correct. Because I feel like one of the biggest problems you have from the YIMBY housing construction crowd, because we haven't even talked about apartment buildings and different styles of housing in contrast to single family homes, is that if you are in favor of those changes to the way that a city looks or the way that you conceptualize getting to work or going into the city of your kids, you're running into preset American expectations. You're hitting 5 or 6 different culture wars on the way there, this or that. So making those arguments up front, I'll just say, I was just in New York over the weekend. My wife and I just hate riding the subway. We don't enjoy walking around as much. We love getting to the Austin airport and just driving. So if you come to me and you say, look, Marshall, the way that we're going to have more housing is we're going to start transitioning away from the car. We're going to have much more public transit. I'm just going to have in the pit of my stomach, I don't know about that. Actually, I kind of like the suburbs. Actually, I like driving. This is Texas. If you like that, you should probably move to San Francisco, this or that. But if instead you do the starve the beast from the left thing you're talking about, you say, Marshall, you care about housing. You want people to live here. You're a good faith person. We've built all this housing. The only way we could actually support it is by investing in mass transit, is by looking at these parking requirements. It's just so much easier for me, and I think a lot of voters, to work our way around that than doing the front side version of the conversation. But I'm curious what you think about that.
I mean, I think that cities, look, for all of human history, or which is not that long, but for 5,000
since the 19th century.
No, for cities have generally worked in a pattern in which they expand to the level of transportation, meaning so cities are dense in the middle, they're sprawl out, and then they fold on top of each other. The Upper East Side used to basically be like the hinterlands. They invented, horse, those essentially the horse subways, and then they had electrified subways, and and then we had the car, which allowed America to expand geometrically instead of linearly, i.e. you could go in you build a radius around the entire city instead of having this hub and spoke. Okay, so we have Ed Glazer, who is of course this eminent housing economist, or eminent economist who's focused on housing. He used to say to me, which we never really solved housing problems in this country. We solved transportation problems, meaning that we always made it possible to access more and more and more and more and more land. To some extent, work from home has done that. That was the next technological frontier. You know what I mean? Like that,
yep.
Or social frontier, I should say. The technology has been there forever. But okay, you really can just live in Spokane, right? Eventually, though, that runs out, and much as people did in the past, the city folds back on top of itself, right? So I'm sure the driving around Austin is relatively pleasant, right? But let me tell you one place where it isn't pleasant, and that's Los Angeles, where I live. Like the limits of traffic have reached like a level of pain that is, this city cannot continue to grow and thrive in the way that it traditionally had without like a massive change in how it does things, right? It will just stagnate, which maybe is what some people want, right? But it cannot continue to thrive on its current level of infrastructure. It's going to have to either have some amount of transit or self-driving car things, which is starting to happen now, right? Are going to have to change how people get around. I don't know what it is, but my point is Austin might just be in an earlier stage of that, right? It might be that you can just keep building to sort of further and further and further and further. And then if it is so lucky as to become a mega region that is one of the world's regions like Southern California is, it will have to rethink things. So you see what I'm saying? Like, not everything has to be like, let's contemplate how we're going to live 50 years from now. Don't get me wrong. There should be planners who are doing that sort of thing. The other thing I will say regarding at a higher level, what we are dancing around right now on both of these things is, and then let's get to what I think might be a middle ground solution. Mm-hmm. It is very hard to rebuild a city once it exists, right? It is, there are too many people there. It's too disruptive. That's why all the great public works projects that you've heard of, like the subway or whatever, have some horrific social displacement like story attached to it. Redevelopment, destroyed all these Black neighborhoods in cities around the country, right? Building the subway, they just moved all these people. There's all these stories about Central Park, building Dodger Stadium, they displaced all these people. Anytime some big thing like that happens in a place that exists, there is inevitably some horrible story of just like kicking people out of where they were, right? And that reflects how difficult it is to do a new, to do something in a place that exists, because once it exists, people are entrenched in it and their homes are there, right? Okay. There's, as I'm sure you and your listeners have talked about in the past, one of the most famous kind of urban books of all time is The Power Broker. There's a story about how Robert Moses essentially rebuilt New York with all these public works and tunnels and parkways and freeways and different things. in the post-war, I guess that he began pre-war, but in what became kind of the
culminates in that post-war period.
So in that book, Robert Caro makes this just arresting statement. I could go pull it off my shelf and read it to you, but I'll spare you the time. But it's essentially some version of building large public works projects in established cities where it disrupts a lot of people is a problem for which democracy does not yet have an answer, or something like that. And then he sort of goes on to say, democratically run cities, there is no example of a democratically run city reforming itself in a big physical way, right? Absent either being destroyed by war or a disaster. Now, there are examples of dictators doing it. Mm-hmm. Right? And his point was that Robert Moses is in effect a dictator, right? But there is not an example you can find. I challenge all of your listeners to find me an example of a democratically run place massively physically reforming itself in places that already were built out. I don't think there is one. If there is one, we should all go study it.
And to understand this real quick, because obviously democratically run cities, states, et cetera, use eminent domain, but we're talking about it at a different scale here, right? Like you can't eminent domain in the way we kind of think of like what's happening like in Atlantic City and New Jersey.
I'm not saying they've never redeveloped a particular neighborhood or done anything. You know what I mean? I'm more just saying
at the scale of the crisis we're describing, or the opportunity that Robert Moses is obviously referring to, it can't just be done through the straightforward process, basically.
No, totally. I mean, there are neighborhoods that have gradually densified through, so, right. Okay. So I guess I'm just saying at the scale I'm talking about, I'm sure someone's going to come back at me with some great example, but generally speaking, this is true, right? Otherwise we wouldn't have all these single family neighborhoods that resist everything all the time because the land prices are telling you this should no longer be, this land is now too valuable for that land use, right? But they remain because there's tremendous political weight in keeping things that way. Anyway, what I'm saying is that reforming cities, both politically and physically, is really, really hard. So I think that the cost of that housing, both because the land is expensive and because building it is like a pain in the ass, basically. It's harder to drive a truck down the street and make a bunch of left turns on the way to the construction site. It's a lot easier to go, to the middle of nowhere and build a bunch of suburban houses, right? And it's funny. I think one of the things you will hear this fact thrown around, it gets thrown around in California all the time. They always go, oh, you will hear people blend these facts. They go, we built more in the 70s for a smaller population than we do today, right? Now, of course, fact one, people are misleading, is the population was growing like crazy. So that's kind of a different animal than just the straight population. Two, they then will do the sleight of hand. And then we used to build apartment buildings like this, and then they'll point to some apartment building they built in like the 40s, right? When we were building massive amounts of housing in California and everywhere else in the 70s, it was like building out the San Fernando Valley, and it was massive sprawled subdivisions that we were building. Like that's what was happening. And I rarely hear the people who bring that fact up say, and thus we should build more crappy subdivisions everywhere. You know what I mean? Like I don't, like that's not the art. They're using a data point that is reflective of that to make a point about building apartments. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just like not, it's not to say that we couldn't mass build apartments. We totally could. I'm just saying it's not exactly the same thing. And it's not quite as easy as they're making it seem based on those numbers. But so I think that we've gotten to a place, so this is my middle ground thing I was going to tell you about, where if we are going to solve this crisis at the level that it is now, some massive greenfield program, which is to say building in the middle of nowhere like we did with subdivisions and everything, is inevitably going to be part of the problem. Now, I'm sorry, part of the solution.
The solution.
And so you've heard people say, Donald Trump, I kind of wish he would talk more about this, but you know how he is. He just sort of throws things out and you don't know whether to follow them or to take them seriously. And they're always so laden with superlatives that you're like, well, wait, whatever you think of Trump, he will throw some ideas out there. And he's so haphazard sometimes that you can't quite tell if it, he's like, oh, we should do this. And then Hannibal Lecter and whatever. And you're just like, I don't know how to take this seriously. But he had said something about, oh, let's build these cities in the middle of nowhere. He has said something about like seeding new cities. I've written a ton about this California Forever project, which is this, a bunch of guys and a bunch of Silicon Valley investors bought a bunch of open farmland and have proposed building a massive community of 400,000 people out there. There are, of course, classic subdivisions that just keep going and going and going. I think that some version of building newer communities that would eventually become cities, building them in a way where things like public transit and all those things are a little easier, more intuitive. You could start to use software then, you know what I mean? Like you could start to have buses that were run on basically a track and with computer. I'm making all this up, right? But I'm just saying having a clean slate does create new opportunities. I'm not saying, and it also creates like a sense of competition, like if all of a sudden having, really cheap computer buses became like this huge preference, you could start to imagine other cities starting to adopt versions of that. Right? I'm making all this up, but what I am saying is that it is easier to build kind of in new places than it is to reform. So we should be doing both, right?
Yeah.
But I also think that we have so much baggage caught up in the suburbs and sprawl and car dependency and cities versus suburb, we have so much baggage caught up in that, but I don't think you have to build places like that. You know what I mean? Like I've gone to a bunch of new, pretty sprawled out developments these days, and people are using e-bikes all around them, e-bikes basically go as fast as a car does in that, you don't go 50 through your neighborhood. You know what I mean? Like the e-bike goes 20, you know what I mean? Like and so anyway, what I'm saying is I do think we're going to have to find some middle ground of these two, building newer communities that people are excited about and seem fresh and interesting and new, and have aspects of urbanity that they like, but also come with some of those cost efficiencies and all that of being kind of easier to build and faster to build. I just don't see, if you're going to be that far behind the problem, it's just really hard to solve that within existing places.
So I'm going to go into politician pitch mode. So I need you to shut this down if I'm wrong about something, because I'm excited when you're articulating this, because I started thinking, what would it look like for, let's say, mirror universe version of Trump who's actually effective and interested and serious and operating in good faith? And we just said, hey, like, look at the CHIPS Act. We've already been investing a lot of money in different parts of the country, building chip fabs, investing in tech, infrastructure, et cetera. Think of another supply side problem, right? Like something I'm just really obsessed with, because like you hear this articulation, it sort of expands your mind. Like how much of the affirmative action debate, which obviously has like very serious racial implications, but how much of like the affirmative action debate within top tier colleges is really just about the fact that we have way more qualified students in any permutation than we have seats. So you could say, like, what if we like built a community that had a top tier university? And I'm not saying this, and also not in the University of Austin sense, which like, I'm not trying to dunk on them, but that's
look
very
at California.
Political. Yeah. Just like
I went to UC San Diego, multiple Nobel Prize winners, all these people at this school. That school was built in like 1960 something. I went there in the 90s. So it's like a 30-year-old college that was at that time already one of the biggest research institutions, one of the most preeminent research institutions in the world. And it was like 30 years old.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, because like I was only speaking ill of University of Austin because I was saying like, thank you for the UC for the San Diego example, because my point was just sort of like,
you could just
put aside
the actual University of Texas.
Yeah, like put aside. Yeah, you could basically do what I just meant was like. University of Austin was just open this week. Like they're launching a new university for ideological purposes. I'm saying let's launch new universities from the supply side seat perspective of, oh, wow, there's a market for like high impact, smart, intelligent, ambitious students. Let's just create seats for them. And then we'll debate what campus protest policies look like in a sort of separate quadrant.
Well, but
I guess what I'm trying to, yeah. Sorry, go on.
No. You're going. If you wanted to get that in there, you can get that in there. It's sort of that's sort of a different point than, as you're pointing out, than what we're talking about. But universities are these great
forcing function.
Well, just think about what a college town is. You know what I mean? Like they create, huge opportunities for research, for development, for UC San Diego, where I went, has now, there's this whole tech transfer thing. They've now basically created all these companies. And look at Stanford, with that's not a public university, but nevertheless. Berkeley, right? I mean, there's all these universities whose economic impact has been pretty. I always say to people, the only reason California isn't Florida is the UC system. It has this highly educated population, this highly dynamic community because of the UC system. I absolutely believe that investment that Jerry Brown's father really, championed, was what made this state took it to the next level on the technology and all that stuff. So anyway, I guess what.
Why aren't we doing this? That's the big one.
I want to say at a high level one other thing.
Yeah.
I don't believe that the federal government can have that much impact on this. It's not to say they can't have any. There are infrastructure bills that you could do. There are all sorts of, there are ways that you could fiddle with housing policy. There are things like Fannie Freddie, other ways in which we incent a certain type of housing. You could change that. Ed Glazer, who I mentioned twice now, but he just wrote a really great op-ed in the New York Times, essentially said we should we tied highway funding to a 21-year-old drinking age in the 80s, that you could do that. You could tie other kinds of funding that states really rely on to infrastructure investments, right? Basically, we can't build this highway or train station unless we're going to build a ton of housing around that, because this infrastructure can't work unless we have growth around it, right? So not only could you do that, it's pretty logical if the government's going to be putting all this money into something. Otherwise, you kind of have a train to nowhere, as they say. But so there are things they can do, right? But I basically believe that it's kind of like crime. We expect presidents to talk about crime right now. There's nothing they can do about crime. Sure, they can do some police grants here or there or whatever. Why do you even care if Biden says fund or defund the police? It's surely a political statement. If a city wants to fund or defund their police, that's kind of up to them. You know what I mean?
I will make a quick counterclaim on this one, not to nitpick.
What I'm saying is that the bully pulpit, the fact that the president is a celebrity who talks about policy, all those kind of more, I guess you could call them leadership things. I think those things matter a lot, but I also believe, I think they matter some, and they create political cover for locals, like, oh, Barack Obama said this, thus you have to be for it. You know what I mean? Like that whole thing is important. But ultimately, I also just think we have to, people have to, the locals have to do it. And also people have to want it. They have to get excited about it again. I got to say, one thing that startles me when I read about the suburbs, in the mass building of post-war suburbs, which people did eventually come to hate. But at the beginning, a lot of people loved it. I mean, again, I'm sure a lot of people hated it the whole time, but what I'm saying is there is all these stories. I mean, there's a story in Life magazine from I said 45 or 46 or something like that. And it's all about how people are living in California and how there's so much, how even working class people there live so well because they're building so many homes and everyone can have a home now. There was just like a level of excitement about trying what amounted to untested systems. Well, what if we just built a suburb here and some schools and in the middle of nowhere, and people were like, let's try it. I mean, there was a huge, essentially there was an optimism about the future, or at least a willingness to try it, that the suburb, I think we've lost sight of the fact that that part of that spirit was part of the early building of the suburbs. And sure, like parts of it turned out to be horrible, and we had all sorts of induced demand, and now cars kill a lot of people. And I mean, there are all sorts of problems with it, but there was also a kind of a willingness to try things that I think we've lost. Now we can only imagine the downsides. To give you this is probably way too nerdy, so you can cut this.
No, but, please go for it.
There are all these things about how, like, finance people will talk about how people try too hard to protect losses. That we're so obsessed with not losing money that we forget to think about foregone gains as essentially lost money. This is the logic of VC, right? You can only ever lose 100% of your money, but you can miss out on a chance to gain 10,000% if you're too focused on always protecting losses, if you're too focused on never taking a risk, right? And I feel like as a society, we've almost become like this. We can only ever see what if we did this? What'll this happen? If we did this, what'll this happen? And what did this? One of the things I've always found about YIMBYs is I've met a lot of YIMBYs who are essentially libertarians. I've met a lot of YIMBYs who tend to be liberals, but the real unifying, and I've a lot of NIMBYs who are hardcore Republicans and a lot of NIMBYs who are hardcore Democrats. And the thing that the YIMBYs tend to share is there's like an empty field or not empty field, like an abandoned lot, and they want to build an apartment complex there. And they're always like, it'll be fine. They just have this, they're like people who, when they cook, they're like, well, I don't know. We'll just kind of figure it out. You know what I mean? Like they just they're like, I got to follow the menu, like they just have a kind of chill. It's like, I think it'll be okay. Whereas the NIMBY attitude is usually like, what if a serial killer moves in there? Huh? What then? Like you're like, I don't know. Like, what if a serial killer moved in next door? Right. And I just feel like as a society, we can only ever see losses now.
Man, you know what I'll say as we close this episode out, if you ever decide to pivot from journalism, you should just go be a PR consultant for these sort of like left libertarian style movements like YIMBYism, because I think the YIMBYs are like way too European centric in the way they articulate these things. Like if we were going to Netherlands bike lane post our way to like transportation reform, it would have worked by now. And I just really appreciate how you gave this very like, we used to have a frontier and we used to build you give this very like nice post-war 19th century articulation of what we should be aiming for here. And I appreciate that.
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm in the can for a particular movement. And the truth is, as these movements gain power, they become more cravenly political because they then need allies and then they need bills. I mean, I love movements when they're at their nascent big tent phase.
Yeah.
I remember, and I kind of hate them once they become, well, here's who our friends are, and we have all these checks. You know what I mean?
You won't be a big fan of the YIMBY Association of America whenever that debuts.
Well, I'm just saying, like the ability to be, to really be trying to do, as they say, addition rather than division is much more pure at that time when there's nothing but possibility and you're only looking for commonality and friends. But I guess, and I should say, any individual project, who the hell knows, right? Like they want to build these, this big city. I was talking about this California Forever thing, which I've written about. There are all sorts of really good questions about whether or not building there is a good idea. Do you have the water? Do you have the whatever? Like, I'm not in any way saying...
Is this too close to a military base?
Yeah, like those are absolutely all questions for which the democratic process, which can be NIMBY in some cases, can be quite reasonable in other cases, that's why it exists, right? But I do think that just as a matter of math, we have reached a point in this problem where building on, and this is something where I've had to change how I think about the problem, right? At the beginning, I was like zoning, and that's not going to be unimportant, but like we have reached a point in the problem where something like how we built in the 70s doesn't have to look the same, but it is going to be on more functionally empty land. I just don't see how you can solve this problem any other way. I mean, and again, you will hear people say, well, Japan is 7 times as dense as San Francisco, thus and it's like, but you can't really do that. You know what I mean? Like, you can't just really bulldoze a city and rebuild it at a particular size. And maybe you can over 200 years or something, which
add in a World War II, literally.
Well, no. I mean, look, New York City, they essentially tore down large parts of it and rebuilt them. Like you can do that over hundreds of years. But I don't, and I think maybe it's the natural evolution of cities that is how it should happen, right? But it's not going to happen if in the scale that everyone says, and everyone would hope that we can help solve this problem and just get back to I don't know how old you are, but I would imagine the housing has been screwed up in some fashion or form your entire adult life, whether it was foreclosure crisis.
Yeah, high school during the great financial crisis. So that's there.
Christ, you only know housing as being like in the news in a very bad way.
Yep.
Different kinds of bad. And I just feel like eventually we have to get to a place where that's just like not, I would just hope that we can find a place to where it's like not all anyone's thinking about.
That is an excellent place to end. Conor, this has been really great. Thanks for joining me again on The Realignment.
Thank you.